Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining this EWG Facebook Live about the FDA's plan to reduce toxic metals such as arsenic and lead in baby foods. Today, we'll be hearing from Scott Faber with EWG, Tom Neltner with Environmental Defense Fund, Brian Ronholm with Consumer Reports, and Jane Houlihan with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. If anyone has questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we will try to answer as many as we can towards the end of today's talk. With that, I will turn it over to Tom.
Yeah, today we heard FDA present scientists that made it clear that this is even more urgent than we originally thought, that the problems of these heavy metals, arsenic and lead and cadmium and mercury, need to be considered together because they're in baby food and children's food together. And the combined effect of that is significant to children's brain development. I've been working on lead for 25 years, and it was even more compelling having heard about them. They did also talk to us about how there are some things we can do to give kids nutrition, better nutrition to soften the blow, but none of them suggested that we shouldn't do everything we can to reduce the amount of lead, arsenic, cadmium, and metal, and have mercury in these children's foods. FDA covered that it's primarily baby food that children eat in that most vulnerable period in the first year. And then it's fruits and vegetables and grains that we need to drive the levels lower on. So it reinforced the basic message that FDA needs to do more, it needs to do faster. It should have been doing this a long time ago. And one of the things I noticed was how, while we've known about the problems for a long time, and FDA has sat on the issue for 5 years, they've had a committee looking at this. What we see is that even more evidence is coming out to drive that we know we need to do more. So we can't just get a number out there and rest on it. We need to keep driving it down. The other one is that we know that there are levels. One that I found most interesting was Cassie Wong had identified that with a joint study EDF had done with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, that there are some canned pears that had really high levels, much higher than the rest, and that FDA didn't seem to take that seriously, didn't investigate it when it looked like there were clear opportunities to drive it lower. I don't know what the problem was. It could have been, pears raised on a farm with lead arsenic pesticides years ago, that it's now picking it up. But for FDA to not use that as an opportunity to drive levels lower and get closer to zero is an example that the agency is talking at this stage, but not walking, and we need to do more.
Great, thank you, Tom. I will turn it over to Brian for his intro now.
Hey everyone, thanks for being with us and appreciate the opportunity to appear with this distinguished panel of fellow advocates. And I want to thank EWG for hosting this important discussion. Many of you are familiar with Consumer Reports, and I hope you rely on us when making purchasing decisions on vehicles, appliances, etc. But we're much more than that. We work for truth, transparency, and fairness on a variety of issues, and that includes food, and for our purposes today, baby food. We have been testing a variety of baby food products and fruit juices for heavy metals for a number of years. In 2018, we tested 50 nationally distributed packaged foods made for babies and toddlers, checking for cadmium, lead, mercury, and inorganic arsenic. Those tests had some troubling findings. Every product had measurable levels of cadmium, inorganic arsenic, or lead. About 2/3 had troubling levels of at least one heavy metal. 15 of the foods posed potential health risks to a child regularly eating just one serving or less per day. Snacks and products containing rice and/or sweet potatoes were particularly likely to have high levels of heavy metals. And an important note, organic foods were as likely to contain heavy metals as conventional foods. The industry test results that were included in 2 congressional reports released this year confirm that this is still a critical issue. And Healthy Baby, Bright Futures, Jane will talk about the results that they had as well, which points to similar findings. And it's especially troubling when you find that in recent years, more and more studies are coming out to show that heavy metals, especially inorganic arsenic, lead, and cadmium, are more hazardous than previously thought. Consequently, there is enough data on the toxicity of heavy metals for the FDA to set mandatory standards or limits on baby foods and fruit juices for infants and children. And based on this evidence, as Tom noted, the timeline for the Closer to Zero program that the FDA has established is too slow, too prolonged. Based on Consumer Reports testing, the FDA should take action immediately on various heavy metals in baby foods, especially fruit juices. Now, we recognize that the American Academy of Pediatric guidelines state that children under 1 shouldn't be given fruit juice. So let's set that aside for a moment. FDA should immediately finalize the inorganic arsenic apple juice draft action level of 10 parts per billion rather than wait until April 2024. Next, the FDA should set a limit for inorganic arsenic in fruit juice of 3 parts per billion. Our testing of heavy metals in fruit juices published in the January 2019 issue of Consumer Reports found that a majority, 58% of samples were below 3 parts per billion. So that is a clear indication that such a limit is achievable. For lead, FDA should set a mandatory standard of lead in fruit juice of 1 part per billion, which mirrors what the American Academy of Pediatrics advocates for school drinking water fountains. Our testing of fruit juices found that a majority of juice samples could meet this 1 part per billion limit for lead, which also demonstrate this is an achievable standard. So finally, we urge the FDA to move more quickly in setting action limits or limits for a range of baby foods. Now, in the absence of FDA action on this issue, we wrote to several major baby food companies urging them to suspend sales of infant rice cereal products due to high inorganic arsenic levels. And we also urged them to test finished product for a more complete reading of what is contained in these products. Gerber didn't respond with they wouldn't suspend sales, but they noted that they conduct testing of ingredients and finished products. And in addition to that, they're conducting research on farm on how to reduce those levels. Walmart revealed to us that they no longer sell their private label brand of infant rice cereal, but they still carry products from other brands in order to fulfill WIC commitments. Earth's Best Organic told us that they are meeting the FDA action level of 100 parts per billion, which we have since all learned that is way too high. And Happy Family, Happy Baby Organics, which is owned by Danone, noted that they no longer sell infant rice cereal, and it was a move that they hadn't publicized, and the same applied to Plum Organics. So thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Brian. I will pass it to Jane next.
Sure, thank you, Iris. And I just want to say thanks to EWG for organizing this event. I'm the research director with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures. And as Brian mentioned, we've done some of our own baby food testing inspired by Consumer Reports, just finding heavy metals prevalent in 95% of the foods that we tested. So it's a problem for every baby. All the 10,000 babies begin eating solid food every day. So, almost 4 million babies a year are exposed to heavy metals in food. I was really pleased today with the panelists that FDA chose. I just thought they did such a great job presenting information about the toxicity of these metals, that there's no known safe level of exposure, particularly for lead and arsenic. They did a great job talking about how babies who are nutritionally deficient, who might not get enough calcium or iron or enough folic acid during pregnancy, that some babies are really highly vulnerable to metals. And so FDA will have to address those really critical issues as they move forward with setting action levels to protect babies. These metals are all toxic at very low levels. They harm the developing brain. So downstream impacts for babies include things like IQ loss, problems learning in school, behavioral problems. So this is really serious. We heard from a lot of the public commenters and the experts as well, and from Brian and Tom just now, that FDA really needs to speed up their timeline on setting standards for heavy metals in baby food. They're saying up to 3 years before we'll have standards for final mandatory standards for lead and arsenic, and then they haven't even given a date for cadmium and mercury. So many commenters said, you guys need to speed that up. We heard from a lot of the experts on the panels that FDA needs to consider additive impacts because babies aren't exposed to only one of these metals. So far to date, we've seen FDA set very weak standards for a few baby foods. So we have a standard for arsenic just in infant rice cereal, and we have a standard, for proposed standards for a couple of metals in fruit juice, but they haven't yet taken a look at the whole picture of how babies are exposed every day to all of these metals. When we tested baby foods, we found a quarter of all the foods we tested had all 4 of the metals that FDA is addressing: lead, arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. So we really need to get beyond this, one metal at a time in one food, the way FDA has been approaching it. We also heard from a lot of experts just saying, FDA needs to, and public commenters, FDA needs to set these limits based on babies' health and not based on conjectures about nutritional deficits or supply problems or other issues. And we have so much experience now to say that the industry, the food industry, the markets can adapt when FDA sets standards. When FDA issued draft guidance for arsenic in juice and infant cereal, we saw levels drop dramatically in those foods. And that was draft guidance. So we know industry knows how to reduce levels when they're finally, have a target out there from FDA. We also know that when the state of Oregon took infant rice cereal off of its Women and Infants and Children program, and that's a program that up to half of the babies in the state are eligible for, there was no problem with cereal supply. Nutritious and alternate cereals have been available. There have been no nutritional deficits for babies. So all these cases say to us, when FDA takes action, the industry can respond. Babies will still have plenty of nutritious foods. So the important thing now is for FDA to move and to actually set these standards in food to protect the, more than 3 million to 4 million babies that are born in the US every year.
Well said. Thank you, Jane. And I will pass it to Scott Faber next.
Yeah, thanks, Iris. I just wanted to add one quick insight before we get to your questions. And if you haven't already put your questions in the chat bar, please do so, and we'll get to them in just a couple minutes. One insight: setting standards to protect our babies' developing brains from these toxic metals will not increase the price of food. And just wanted to share a little bit about that. The cost of baby food is driven by many things, not just the cost of growing the rice or the sweet potatoes or the other raw ingredients. Energy, transportation costs, labor, marketing, processing, packaging, all of these costs make up a much bigger share of the overall cost of making baby food than the cost of just producing those raw ingredients. And many other factors, not just the cost of making the food, impact the price that you and I will wind up paying at the grocery store. So any arguments that you heard made today that higher baby food prices will result if we take steps to protect our babies' developing brains are just wrong. In fact, the food industry made the same bogus claims when some food companies opposed efforts to protect us from pathogens a little bit more than a decade ago. But it turned out that implementation of that food safety law, the Food Safety Modernization Act, did not impact food prices at all. And here's another way we know. As Jane mentioned, FDA has previously set draft levels for arsenic in infant rice cereal and apple juice. And when they did so, baby food prices did not change. But here's something else we learned from our experience with infant rice cereal and apple juice, and it's that FDA should not be looking to current food and farm practices to figure out what's really achievable. And in the case of infant rice cereal and apple juice, what happened was baby food companies simply changed where they source their ingredients, in this case rice, and apples to avoid soils with the highest levels of arsenic. And as Jane said, we saw huge reductions in the amount of arsenic in infant rice cereal and apple juice, 37% and 63% respectively. Again, with no change in the price that consumers wind up paying at the grocery store. So I think the last thing I'll just say about today's meeting was, if it wasn't already clear that toxic metals are an urgent threat to our babies, the scientists we heard from today made the case even clearer. And what's also even clearer today is that the timelines proposed by FDA are just too slow to protect our babies' developing brains. We must go much faster, or millions of babies will be exposed, needlessly exposed, to higher levels of toxic metals. And I will throw it back to Iris so we can answer your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Let's see what questions we have. Okay, here's one. How does FDA ensure that companies are actually following regulations?
Well, I mean, that is a real question, because they set a limit of right now they have a limit of 3 micrograms per day of lead that a child should have in a day as the most. And that is, they know that that's not safe, it's just safe enough. And they know that because of changes at CDC, they know it should go down to 2. But we provided information to them about canned pears, a particular brand of canned pears that had really high levels in it. Levels of, we saw one can wasn't enough of a problem. So what we see is that there's a disconnect between the rhetoric and the actual getting after the industry to make sure they're doing it. It's going to take an aggressive monitoring program. And I don't think they're going to do it without, honestly, congressional action that's going to force them to make this happen in standards, because these action levels they talk about they're soft. The agency can make a decision that that's not enough. One of the things you're going to hear is the word safe. But really, I think you should take safe and put it on the shelf. It's about safer. It's about driving it down, because there isn't a level that's safe for these metals. What we want to do is have it as low as possible. So what we need to do is have FDA set enforceable standards and get these out as soon as possible, and then make sure that companies are complying with it. And that is done through transparency, that's done through inspections, that's done through reporting. It's not done by just setting levels and walking away.
And I'll just quickly add, Iris, that what's really essential is that there be finished product testing, and that those test results are public. So if I'm one of the 3 companies that control the vast majority of this market, I should have to test, as should everyone, regardless of how big they are, test my finished product, make those results available to FDA, but also just make them available to the public. So, and then if the test results show that my product has too much of these lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, these heavy metals, then I should be required to get those off the shelves. And if I refuse to act, then FDA should have the power to compel me. So, until we have finished product testing, we can't know for sure that our babies are being protected.
And it's also, can I just add, it's really important that the standards be mandatory. Right now we have a few action levels from FDA, and when they set an action level for infant rice cereal, we pulled 7 containers off the shelf and 4 of them were over the action level. So companies just, there's no incentive for them to comply with that. They have a lot of discretion. When the congressional reports that have come out this past year, a couple of them show that companies do have internal standards, but then they can just choose to ignore them. And they've done that, quite often, according to the congressional reports. So unless these standards are, mandatory and enforced by FDA, we're not going to see the progress that we need.
Thank you.
I'll just add quickly, another word that you will hear too is resources. Whether the agency has adequate resources to tackle this problem. And this gets to Scott's point about, finished product testing. It makes it that much more critical for these companies to make that information public in order to kind of help consumers make those types of decisions.
Thank you all. I have another question from the audience. What kind of tests are being used to test for these heavy metals, and what are the standards?
Jane, that one looks like your area. You've done a lot of testing.
And Consumer Reports too, but yeah, we test through a laboratory called Brooks Applied Labs outside of Seattle, and they specialize in heavy metals testing for food. So they have great detection limits, super reliable testing methods. And they use ICP-MS techniques, they're called, but they basically can test for arsenic, lead, mercury, and cadmium, and they can also test for the most toxic form of arsenic, which is inorganic arsenic. So it really gives you a great picture of the profile of heavy metals in foods. And it's through that testing that we know that 95% of baby foods have detectable levels of metals, and that 1 in 4 baby foods have all 4 of those heavy metals in a single container, a single pouch, or a single jar. So FDA has their own methods and does their own testing every year, and we've been urging them to also improve their methods, get lower detection limits, because there's no safe level of exposure for babies. So we really need to see continuous improvement with the tests that FDA is doing as well.
And we need to see that data come out. Scott, you talked about transparency, but FDA has testing data from 2018 and 2019. It hasn't made them public. And I understand that they want to have everything all wrapped up in a nice bow on it. But the reality is that this information will help us, it'll help parents, it'll help the companies be able to recognize problems. So why are they holding up on this data when we know it's important to decision making?
I think we have time for at least one more question. Let me throw this out there. This might be another one for Jane, but I'll let you all decide. Curious what you think about whether or how EPA's IRIS toxicity assessments may or should be considered in FDA's development of these closer to zero action levels. I know IRIS is working on updates to the arsenic, inorganic mercury salts, and methyl mercury IRIS assessments.
Well, I do hope the agencies work together so that they're on the same page and have similarly stringent health-based action levels. So I don't know, Tom, maybe have you been following the IRIS process closely on these?
I haven't, but I worry that too much of it is going to be used as an excuse to wait. We know the FDA has said we don't see any evidence that there's a safe level of arsenic or cadmium or lead in food. So we shouldn't wait for more evidence and hold off. It's too easy to say we need more science or it's complicated. This is the time for action. We know we can get changes. When you see as much variability as I've seen on the data, where some samples are high and some samples are low, you should be focusing on how to drive those levels low and prioritize it. What are the best practices? And that's where Scott's point on transparency is helpful, because that way let companies compete for the very best. You heard a presenter, I don't know, I've never met Serenity Carr, but she talked about her products and how they're trying to do the best. That's the kind of attitude that we want from all the companies. But it has to be beyond just baby foods. It also needs to be on children's food. So parents, especially if you don't have the money, are going to be shopping for carrots on the produce aisle, or grapes, or squash and sweet potatoes. So we need to make sure we cover those. And that's why I'm looking forward to Jane's report that'll come out in January that'll compare baby food to foods made from the produce aisle. So I'm looking forward to seeing that, Jane.
And there are plenty of things parents can do to help reduce their children's exposures, but unfortunately, just making homemade food is not really the answer, is what the data is looking like so far, because these heavy metals are in every grocery store aisle.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Which specific foods seem to have highest levels of heavy metals in organic baby food?
Well, I think,
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry, go
Scott.
ahead, Jen. So I was just
I was
going to
just
say, I
gonna
think
say-
all the evidence suggests that buying organic is not a solution, that organic food is just as likely as conventional food to have high levels of toxic heavy metals. There are lots of other good reasons to choose organic food. I think, as you probably know, you cannot have toxic pesticides in organic food production. There are very few food chemicals that have been authorized, the preservatives and other chemicals that are added to food that are authorized for use in organic food. There are a lot of good reasons to choose organic. Avoiding heavy metals, unfortunately, is not one of them.
Excellent, thank you. That's all the time we have for today. So I'll just say thank you to all of our speakers who joined. We appreciate you, and thank you for everybody who tuned in. If you are looking for more information on these topics, please check out ewg.org.
Thanks to EWG for hosting this. It's important to have this kind of forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.